Joining me now is foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Greg, thanks as always. Before we get to Australia's most recent contribution to Ukraine, the military package, let's start with a look at the Wagner uprising or aborted uprising. What's the impact ongoing for Putin and his leadership, his authority in that country?
Well, I think Putin is clearly weakened. One of the oligarchs whom he created. I mean, this guy was 9 years in prison and then was a hot dog salesman before Putin made him wealthy and powerful. Has defied the Russian military and marched on Moscow. And whereas everyone else who has defied Putin up to now has ended up dead pretty quickly, this guy's still at large, putting out defiant videos. And all the men who marched with him, although we don't really know how many that was, are also apparently going to get an amnesty. So Putin looks here to be running a very ramshackle government with very ineffective institutions, vicious, brutal and ruthless, but pretty incompetent. And, it looks as though he's held on to power for the moment, but you'd have to say he's weakened. He is a weakened and more desperate dictator than he has ever been, and he is a very, very paranoid person.
And it would weaken the broader military effort too, would it not, versus a cohesive and very much a military with high and strong morale out of Ukraine?
Yeah, so the Wagner group are unspeakably vicious. Their symbol is a sledgehammer because they execute a number of prisoners by beating them to death with sledgehammers. They castrate Ukrainian soldiers as an act of sexual humiliation after they're taken prisoner, or a number of them anyway. They are an unspeakably vicious, terrible group, but they are more militarily effective than the Russian army. So removing them from the order of battle in Ukraine has got to weaken the Russians. But it's very tough for the Ukrainians to make huge gains in this spring offensive because overcoming well-defended positions, even if they're defended by troops with low morale, is very difficult. The Russian positions are defended by landmines and, trenches, and the Ukrainians don't have air superiority. Very, very difficult for an offensive force to gain huge ground in that circumstance.
You've been critical of the Australian government's latest contribution to Ukraine, including, and importantly, the fact that this expenditure, 110 million, comes from within Defence's funding envelope, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely, Kieran. I mean, this whole thing is a joke, really. The government's having a lend of us. These people at Fort Fumble who haven't got an equipment decision right in Australia for 50 years suddenly know better what Ukraine needs than the Ukrainians themselves. And what a surprise. It turns out that what Ukraine really needs is these junk armoured personnel carriers, which we built at the time of the Vietnam War. They need those. They're better suited to Ukrainian terrain than our brand new, hot off the production line, Bushmasters and Hawkeyes. Well, if you believe that, Kieran, I've got a Harbour Bridge to sell you. I mean, even the value of the thing at $110 million. I mean, if the government can't bear to give the Ukrainians anything of consequence, then just give them $110 million. But there's no way this package is worth $110 million. This is like Arthur out of The Minder saying, tell, I've got a 1959 Vauxhall for you. It's worth 20,000 quid. I mean, I tell you what, the $110 million, it's a valuation entirely made up by the Australian government. The heart of this thing is the government is welshing on its commitment to spend seriously on defence. I'm very reluctantly coming to this conclusion. And other nations like Britain, they say, well, if we give kit from the British Defence Force to Ukraine, we will replenish that kit. Now, the government could do that easily. The Ukrainians want Hawkeyes and Bushmasters. We manufacture Hawkeyes and Bushmasters. It'd be easy as apple pie for the government to say, we're going to give Ukraine 100 Hawkeyes and 100 Bushmasters, and we're going to place an extra order of 100 for each to be built in Australia. Nothing is happening in defence industry at the moment. Defence industry is shedding jobs. Nothing is happening in Australia because everything was delayed for the Defence Strategic Review, and then it has just proliferated into a whole series of new reviews. We still don't know what missiles we're going to build, if any, ever. But the government won't do that, because to do that, you'd have to pay for an extra 100 Hawkeyes and an extra 100 Bushmasters. They're actually taking money out of the defence budget. Defence is funding some of the money to go to foreign affairs, which is bizarre. Foreign affairs negotiates treaties for all sorts of interests in Australia, but the treaties they negotiate for defence. Defence is going to come out of the defence budget. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute calculates that the impact of inflation and foreign currency changes means the government is actually going to cut $1.5 billion out of defence spending next year. There's another $1.8 billion of cuts which they haven't yet identified to go towards paying for the early stages of the nuclear-propelled subs. And now they've told defence that anything you give to Ukraine, we're not going to replace. So guess what? The army says, well, here's the junk which we're about to throw out anyway. We're going to put it on the rubbish bin, but instead of putting it on the rubbish bin, we'll give it to you poor Ukrainians. It has no protection against mines or anything like that. It's a worthless bit of kit. But here you go, you can have it for free, and it's worth $110 million. I think the whole episode is embarrassing.
We've only got about 20 seconds left, but quickly, how would that be received when the Prime Minister gets to the NATO summit in Lithuania next week, or in a couple of weeks?
Well, it's in no one's interest to embarrass the Australians. I mean, we're a good allied member, and the Ukrainians still hope we might do more useful things in the future, and we did give them some Bushmasters in the past. Sure. So everyone will be polite about it, but we should tell ourselves the truth of what we're doing. We're doing nothing, and we're telling ourselves lies about it, and it's part of a general miasma of hopelessness in defence.
Greg Sheridan, thanks. Talk to you soon.